Hi, my name is Brett Hancock, and I just want to start a YouTube channel here and start sharing some things that I think that God has shown me. Um, there's a ton of people saying that out there, right? It's sometimes it can be somewhat cliche. Um, but yeah, I just feel like in last, let's put it this way. I guess I shared a little bit about myself. Um, in April 2009, um, God brought me up out of, just like the prodigal son story, if you know that story, brought me up out of the mud in the pit of sin that I was living in. A radical turn that day happened, and I guess maybe sometime I'll share more details about that and stuff, but suffice it to say there's been a lot of ups and downs with my life with regard to God and what I understood and what I believed and what I experienced, and the inner turmoil and discouragement that sometimes led me to walk away from God at different points. And so I mean, just in essence, I guess a real short, quick thing. I remember when I was 5 years old. I remember my mom having a preacher. We lived in a small town in Iowa, and a preacher came to the door, and of course, as you can possibly try to recall that at 5 years old kind of thing. I'm not going to remember much details, but I do remember it wasn't long. We're going to church, and so we were going to a Baptist church, and so it wasn't long. We moved to the big city of Des Moines, Iowa, and Baptist church and everything. But then a couple of years, she started going to a Pentecostal or charismatic church and stuff, and so as I being there a few years and stuff, of course, as you're growing older, you're starting to actually be a little bit more aware of things, and not to mention it's easier to recall things and stuff. But yeah, I just remember it was the whole thing was based on the way they interpret faith was all based on miracles, and and not saying that God can't do miracles, whether it's in the past or today or anything, but what happens is what happened with them is they were so focused on that, ignoring like Matthew 7, where Jesus talks about the people that came to him and said, hey, didn't we do all these things? We did miracles, we were casting out demons, we were doing all these things, and Jesus said, away from me, you lawless people, you evildoers, you workers of iniquity, I never knew you, and so much about the teachings of Christ I'm going to try and unfold in this channel, in a lot of different aspects and a lot of different things that my friends are encouraging me to make a channel and stuff. The things I've learned, from the early Christians as I got into them about 5 years ago, and I just spent the time with the second century Christians going over and over and over and over and over and over. I mean, some of the writings I've gone over so many times. It's a blessing that we've got a lot of them narrated and available on audio, whether it's YouTube or whatever, and you can just listen to them over and over and over. And so the impact that's had on my life is I've revisited the New Testament and seen that things that I believed were wrong, and just all the puzzle pieces it's just come together. So anyway, going back to my childhood, so it was basically a church that was just phony. It was all fake. I mean, not to mention the pastor's wearing a toupee and stuff, but I mean every year. I mean that church is just my mother, full of poor people. I mean, we're living on welfare. I'm going to school getting free lunches and stuff. Everybody's poor, and yet he's teaching this false doctrine, about giving in a way to where they get rich, which the New Testament clearly calls that kind of thing as being idolatry and stuff. And just so many warnings that we're going to go over on this channel about how God feels about how you handle wealth and stuff. And the new teaching that Jesus brought that just completely undermines and turns upside down the paradigm that this world follows, which is taught by the Prince of Evil, Prince of Darkness, that leads to self-indulgence and selfishness and stuff like that. So anyway, so that's what this whole thing was about. And so, without going into a lot of details and stuff, within a couple of years, with just so much sin in the church. I mean, even with young people and stuff, sexually and stuff going on and stuff, it was just a wicked so-called church and stuff. And so after a few years I started to get into my pre-teens and stuff, and what my mom decided to believe about what Christianity was about and stuff eventually led us to a point to where I ended up moving with my dad in Pennsylvania, and finished my growing up there. So anyway, during those years, about age 14, 15, I kind of just started believing that the Bible wasn't true. Christianity is not true. And I started allowing for the first time for myself to actually start swearing, saying, cuss words or whatever. And started more and more being, as a lot of young people are tempted to be, focused on, sexual things or whatever. And so as I got out of high school, I went in the military, and I was just going down that typical road, as most men do, of just pursuing, it'd be improper for me to use the kind of language that I used back then and stuff. But I think a lot of us know that kind of path and stuff. So just the immorality, the trial and error, the disposable, girlfriend, or even women do the same thing with men, disposable, mate or disposable girlfriend or boyfriend approach to life, and just the other things that leads to and stuff, and got into a lot of things, bodybuilding and stuff like that, and just so much vanity and so much stuff, and just pursuing that, like I know a lot of women do as well, but I know men do as well. I mean, this is the path that the Prince of Darkness leads us to, is to use those things as like bait in a fishing hook, or a lure or something, and fishing, so that you can, just enjoy the path of pleasure and stuff. So that's some other stuff that we'll talk about on this channel, is this distinction between this constant theme in Paul's letters about following the path of the flesh and the desires of that versus following the path of the Spirit, and that repentance that leads you in that direction, and the path of the flesh that leads to destruction and eternal destruction and stuff. But yeah, so anyway, in my late 20s, I was reached out to, by some people, very sincere, as they understood Christianity and stuff. And this is when I was a student at the University of Central Florida, and studying engineering, just finishing up my bachelor's in engineering technology, and electrical engineering technology, actually. And finished up my bachelor's, and just getting ready to go into my master's. And so became a part of that group, and was really going hard after the scriptures. And I remember just even when I first encountered the scriptures with them, it took a lot of effort on their part to get me to actually sit down and actually look at them. But once I did, and I started seeing some of the things that Jesus said, I had no idea that Jesus actually spoke this way in the Bible. So once I started seeing him saying these things, not everybody feels this way, but for me, even though I was living the kind of life I was, I still had this level of like respect for the Bible, that if the Bible said it, like, whoa, I believed it. Now everybody's not there, so a lot of the things I'm going to have on this channel will be actually things on, taking a look at evolution. And I've been a design engineer, electrical engineer for 17 years, and so, I'll draw from the things that, God has helped me just in general of understanding technical things and stuff, to connect with a lot of the scientists that in this realm of a discipline called intelligent design and stuff, and just things even from nature. I mean, I'll call it creation, because I'm convinced at this point that it is. But yeah, we'll just talk about some of those things as well. We're going to talk about a lot of things. We're going to talk about, a lot of controversial things. We're going to talk about, the fear of God. Does God want us to fear? What's the role of the fear of God? Why do we need to fear God? What about love? Is it conditional or is it unconditional? The coming judgment. What's that about? Are Christians going to be judged? And a lot of these sorts of things. And so, as I made this radical turn, going back to what I was talking about, this is back in the 1990s. Well, within a few years, 3.5 years, and this happens to a lot of people, human beings, and me looking, almost like using as spectacles through human beings and my understanding of Scripture, stumbled me. And I think a lot of people get caught up. There's a lot of, the church I was a part of was considered a cult. There's a lot of them out there that are considered cults. And I'm not going to get into that, because that's semantics, and that's a debate about things that is just opinionated and stuff. But the point is, you go back to the Scripture and say, what does the Scriptures teach? What aspects are they actually following? What aspects are they not? What kind of destructive bad things result because of them foregoing these other things? And how does that cause people to stumble and stuff? And so anyway, I'm going to get into those sort of things. But anyway, so I ended up walking away from the church. I ended up walking away from God. I was convinced, and I think a lot of people are, and there's certain churches out there, there's certain Christian denominations out there, whatever, that, like, if you're not in our church, you're not a Christian, right? And so sometimes they keep that internal and they don't really broadcast it to the outward public. They won't admit it, but in amongst all their, followers and stuff, their disciples or whatever they call themselves, that's what they believe and that's what people are taught. And so that's what I was taught. And so because of that, I believe that. But I went on staff, worked for the church for this is I think January 1998, and within 9 months, it's a rough ride. There were people in the church. I saw leadership behind the curtain. It's almost, it reminds me of the story when I was a kid watching The Wizard of Oz, and the wizard being behind the curtain, and once Dorothy saw the man behind the curtain, he's like, never mind the man behind the curtain, kind of thing. But anyway, so that's what I experienced those 9 months in that church, and I saw behind the curtain. I saw the harshness and the impatience and the arrogance and the leadership, all these things. But because I felt like if I really saw it for what it was, that I was in sin, so I didn't let my think about it. I was just constantly like humbling myself with, oh, okay, there's something wrong with me and stuff. Within 9 months, I ended up getting fired. And so I'd walked away from my bachelor's and my master's, put it on the shelf to go down this path because I just wanted to be, a good disciple for Christ and just give up everything like he talks about. And so with 9 months, I was fired, and that sent me in a tailspin. And within a year, with the experience I had with that group of people, I started just so disheartened. I mean, I didn't have any close relationships. I was just so lonely. There's tons of people, probably like 600, 700, 800 people in the church, and yet the way the church was is divided up in sectors and stuff. So you got to stay in your own sector, and if there's nobody relatable there and stuff, it's kind of difficult for you to get together with other ones across town or something. And so this is in Orlando, actually, where I live. So anyway, so all that to say, I started wanting my old life again. So I started like going back into some of these bad sexual behaviors and stuff that I had, but not that often, but enough, frequently enough that eventually I just, between the two, I ended up leaving. And in retrospect, I know that God was kind of like what 1 Corinthians 5 says. 1 Corinthians 5 commands the church to not live walking with the flesh. And again, we're going to talk about these things, but it gives lots of examples of what that looks like. Galatians 5:19-21 also gives pictures of what that looks like. And that's not an exhaustive list, but it's a picture of following that path, of all the things that the flesh desires and stuff. And so that those kind of people, 1 Corinthians 5 says you got to put them out of the church. You turn them over to Satan, you put them out of the church. So this is analogous to how in the Old Testament, God talked about bread that's with and without yeast, and how in the New Testament we start to see spiritual meaning of these things more than was revealed in the Old Testament. And so that Jesus' body being the bread, that you're to put the yeast out, and the yeast was a foreshadowing, a picture of sin and stuff. Similarly, how a person with leprosy, that was a picture of somebody having sin, and so the healing of the sin that Jesus did, the leprosy, is a picture of somebody being set free from the kingdom of darkness and not, being washed clean and, being, having imputed righteousness in a sense, his blood sprinkled on us at conversion and stuff that sets us free from the kingdom of darkness and washes us clean and stuff. So, but anyway, so I started going back in that path, and so this would be in like November 1999, and so I walked away from God, and within a short period of time, it was pretty much sort of like, to use a swimming pool for analogy. I mean, I started stepping in on the shallow end. Next thing you know, I'm in the deep end and stuff. I'm going back to my old life, sexual sin and stuff. In some regards, was worse than I was living before, which is kind of a picture of what Jesus talks about in the Gospels. There, he talks about a person, how his, like the house is being swept clean, which is a picture of somebody's soul. And so the spirit that was cast out, is roaming throughout the earth in arid places or waterless places. Couldn't find any, domain to settle in. So he came back, grabbed 7 more, and they stormed the Bastille, so to speak, and ransacked the house, which is a person's soul. The person obviously wasn't resisting the devil. He wasn't putting on the full armor of God. And so they came in, they took over again, and that person was worse off than he was before, more corrupt and unrighteous and perverted than he was before and stuff. And so that was kind of my situation. So after a couple years, I at least was able to see that the lifestyle I was living was self-destructive, and if I continued down that path, I was going to be destroyed and stuff, spiritually speaking and stuff. But also over time, there was a good number of years until April of 2009 came. So there was really over 9 years that I was actually away from God. Well, during that period of time, like I said, there was a couple years there where I was living in total sin. But then I met a woman, and within a couple of years, because again during that time I knew that I was going to be destroyed, so I knew that I needed to get married. So at this point, I was kind of getting towards my upper 30s, and so met this woman, and so it wasn't long. It was a couple of years or whatever. We ended up getting married, and so I'll talk about that also on this channel too, about divorce and remarriage. And eventually, once I did repent and come after God, I ended up going back to this old church, and went through a period of restoration, different things. But I had a little concern, even when I was getting married. I had little concerns. She was married twice before, so she was, divorced and remarried. So here she was marrying me, third time and stuff. So it had a little bit of recall. Not that the church was teaching what the early Christians understood, or even the Anabaptists as well, about divorce and remarriage. Today, the Anabaptists. But I'd never understood any of that. But I did remember seeing passages from Jesus that talked about, and I know the church I was a part of had a very strong stance against divorce. And up until the early 2000s, I forget exactly when all of a sudden the proverbial dam broke or whatever, and then tons of people started getting divorces. But throughout like the 80s and 90s or whatever, the church pretty much boasted how they didn't have any divorces, and of course, no divorces, no remarriage. At least in that regard, of course, they could have been remarried before they came into the church. But anyway, so I don't want to make this a big thing about divorce and remarriage. But anyway, so April 2009. So when I did this radical turn, and just cried like a baby, just broke emotionally, just so missed God. I just there was such a brokenness, a desire to want to know God, to be reconciled with God. And I can't explain it. I just know that there was things that was happening in my life. I was totally addicted to pornography and stuff like that at that point. And so there was just this radical turn. And that was April of 2009, and God has set me free from that. I never looked back, sort of like Lot leaving Sodom and never looked back. Or Joseph, if you know in the book of Genesis, the story of Joseph, when the Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him and he ran out. And that was basically, praise God, to his glory. That's what I did. And I just went hard after God, and I just started listening to as many sermons as I could, for what I understood was good for edification and stuff from this church I was a part of. And then started listening to things more and more over time. And then also, just as much as possible as I had free time, I was reading the scriptures constantly, especially the New Testament. And the more I was reading it, the more I was just really things were starting to click and starting to make sense, and the more deeper my faith was getting and stuff. Within about a year and a half, there was a brother in the church that said, "Hey, have you ever read this book by this guy, David Bercot," is what I was calling him at the time. It's actually French. It's David Bercot, Bercot. So, but his book, The Kingdom That Turned the World Upside Down, and I had no idea what was about to happen as I would read this book. So anyway, he lent me the book, and I started reading this book, and it rocked my world. It really did. It really made me re-examine much about what I understood, the meaning of New Testament scriptures, and what some of the things Jesus would say, things like John 8:31-32. It was one of our big mantras in the church. We didn't understand it literally the way Jesus said it. We kind of understood it as he was talking about the whole Bible. But, Jesus speaks this way a lot in the Gospels. He says, to the Jews that believed him, Jesus said, if you hold to, or if you persevere, if you continue to practice, if you hold to my teachings, or if you hold to my words, literally is what it is, logos, If you hold to my words, you're really my disciples. You're really my students, my thetes in the Greek. Then you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Well, Jesus said he's the truth. He's the way, the truth, and life. John 14, verse 6. So how do you know the truth? How do you know Jesus? By doing what he says, right? So we didn't understand that. We didn't really take what Jesus taught in the Gospels that seriously. We didn't practice the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain, all these teachings of Jesus. We didn't really, I mean, that wasn't anything that we really held people to. It was just like, in general, we need to kind of do what the Scriptures say. And there was more an emphasis in the church I was a part of about making sure that you're doing what your elders, what your, the hierarchy, the leadership in the church is saying. Which is really very similar to what you see in the Gospels, where Jesus is rebuking that approach, where people were being taught by their leaders that they need to listen to them, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin, the teachers of the law, put more emphasis on them than the Old Testament teaching, the prophecy, the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms, and so that's pretty much what I was a part of in this. So when I read this book, The Kingdom to Turn the World Upside Down, it really helped me. I went through all these different chapters. One of the chapters was on divorce and remarriage. But as I exited that chapter, I thought I was okay. From the way I understood the scriptures, I thought I was okay. And so just exiting that book, as I read the book, the biggest thing that impacted me was, wow, I'm not really taking serious what Jesus teaches. I need to start really looking and going over and over and over and over what Jesus teaches in the Gospels and start putting it into practice, right? So when I started doing that, that started taking me to another level too. And so within 6 months, I don't remember exactly when, I found out that David Brousseau had this book called Will the Real Heretics Please Stand Up? And so just so you know, in case you don't know, David Brousseau, in the mid-1980s, was where he came from in his church. Everybody starts somewhere. And he was seeking truth. He knew things weren't making sense. From what he was being taught, scriptures don't line up 100% in things, which is similar to what I was experiencing. And so he got a hold of, based on what somebody said, he found out about these ante-Nicene Fathers writings, which is a 10-volume set. It's pretty thick, of starting from right around the time of just before the last apostle died, who was the Apostle John, according to these writings that we have, around 100 A.D., sweeping through to about 300-ish, just before, if you've ever heard of the Council of Nicaea, which is somewhere around 325, when in Nicaea, in that area, in Rome area and everything, where Constantine had come into the church at that period of time. So anyway, that whole 10-volume set capturing all those things, he sat down in that year when he got a hold of them, he just started reading the whole thing. And so he even admits that he kind of ignored his family that year a little bit and stuff, or neglected them a little bit and stuff. It just was just hungry in those writings and stuff. And so he, like me and like most people, as you start going back and look at what the early Christians say, like a Berean, Acts 17 verse 10, 11, the Bereans would go back and take what Paul said, just like I did, just like David Brousseau has, like everybody does. It's like, hey, here's what they're saying. Here's how they understand the apostolic teaching. Let's go back to the scriptures to see if what the scriptures really say. Well, with the Bereans, they were going back to the Old Testament to see if these prophecies about the Messiah was really true, and we should do it likewise. But some of us were told that the teachings of the apostles mean this or that. Well, we should be going back to the teachings of the apostle, which is the apostles in our New Testament. Is that really what it says? And so he did that as he's studying through the early church, and it just, light bulbs started going off. And I can tell you this has been my experience. And so it rocked my world. I started seeing a lot of things that I believed, not everything, but a lot of things that I believed were just in either largely wrong or partially wrong or something. But there was a lot of error, and that was the reason why a lot of the puzzle pieces didn't line up, and there were gaps and things that didn't make sense. And some areas seemed to make sense, but other areas didn't quite line up with things. And so anyway, so with my story, as I got into the early Christians, first of all, with Scroll Publishing, that's where David Brousseau, material, among other materials, are offered. If you want to check out Scroll Publishing, they're on Facebook, but I encourage you, scrollpublishing.com. Check out their website, but look at the early Christian section. But I just started getting everything they had on early Christians. I just started eating it up, and I would listen to it so much and so often, I would even have it playing while I was going to sleep. And So yeah, that first year, I mean, there was a lot of that. But then it started to get within that year to where I started actually picking up some of these second century writings myself. Justin Martyr, I think he was converted somewhere around 130 is pretty much what experts say, and somewhere around from there to tradition says that he was died as a martyr around 165. So during that those few decades and stuff, some of the writings that we have, some of them are disputed a little bit, even though I've read some of them and I'm like, no, I think some of those are pretty good. But definitely the three that I've gone over quite a bit, and the first two, First Apology of Justin Martyr and the Second Apology of Justin Martyr, the first few years, man, I went over that so much, and it really rocked my world. It really made me re-examine what the New Testament says and start to see things started making sense. And I can say one of the biggest things that I've noticed that the early Christians had the first few centuries, a very strong understanding on is the two kingdoms, the kingdom of darkness. Just like David Brousseau would talk, in some of his CDs on the two kingdoms. And so when he contrasts the kingdom of God versus the kingdom of this world, in a lot of his teachings, he focuses on the visible part, the people of this world that are part of those kingdoms. But the early Christians talked a lot about behind the curtain, which is the demons and the fallen angels and Satan, who's in charge. He's the prince of this world, as Jesus said. And so he's the top of the hierarchy for all the kingdoms of this world. And so I started really starting to understand more in seeing in light what the New Testament is talking about. Seeing why Ephesians 6 is talking about putting on the full armor of God, a little bit more about what that's talking about, and what James is talking about, resist the devil as he flee from you. And starting to really understand that the Gospels aren't just showing Jesus casting out demons. But why is the Old Testament not talk about that so much, the Old Testament that we have? But then also in the New Testament, the parts in the epistles that kind of point to some of that. And, some of the things in Colossians where it talks about, in chapter 1, how Jesus' work on the cross was a complete defeat of them. There was a spiritual battle going on there. And some of the things that we're taught about what happens, what happened on the cross with Jesus, the early Christians never talked about that, whether it's, the aspect of the Father pouring out his wrath on his Son, that's not what they talked about at all, and I don't even see that in the New Testament anymore. I grew up on that my whole life, but here I am. I started going down this road when I was age 45, somewhere around there. So anyway, so it's been quite a road, quite a experience and stuff, and I'm going to share quite a bit about, by going over and over and over these second century writings. I'll just give you some of them. So much in the last 5 years. It's just helped me so much. The earliest ones I'll mention first. So we got, I think it's 7 or 8 letters from Ignatius. I've gone over them a few times in the last 5 years. Not that much. And then we have a letter, I've gone over a little bit more, from Polycarp. And one of the letters from Ignatius is to Polycarp, right? And I'll talk about who these guys are in a second. And David Brousseau's book, Will the Real Heretics Please Stand Up, really give a nice introduction to all this. So you can find out who the characters are, in these first, second, third centuries. I should say mostly second and third centuries. So you'll know who these writers are and stuff. But another one would be Clement. So First Clement to the Corinthians, that writing. We have a writing that's called Second Clement, and everybody agrees now, I agree too, that it was actually a very, very early sermon, possibly late first century, potentially maybe early second century, but in any case very early. And according to church history, as I mentioned, the Apostle John died around 100 AD. And so this sermon has such a nice, you can find some of these. I'll mention the ones you can find on YouTube where somebody has narrated them. One guy, Apocryphally 1970, has narrated a lot of these writings. As I've learned about Gnostics and Gnosticism and stuff, and a lot of the other writings that are Gnostic, or even some of the ones that came very later that were put together by what, as far as doctrine goes, we would understand as the Catholic Church, which was significantly different, even though you can find some little pieces of things. The Catholics would go, aha, see, the early church in the 2nd century, they were practicing Catholicism, and that nothing could be further from the truth. But we'll talk more about that later on. But anyway, a lot of these early writings. So First Clement to the Corinthians, amazing writing. Second Clement, like I said, that sermon, just gives a nice, the narration that Apocryphally 1970 did is about a 20-minute listen, and I can tell you in the last 5 years, I bet you I've listened to it at least 30 times, if not 40 times, and it's so amazing. It really helps the New Testament make a lot more sense and stuff. And then, of course, the more you expose yourself to these early church writings, and I'll mention more of them, it's just gonna start falling into place. It's all gonna start making more sense. And I can't emphasize enough of really going after truth, because there's many people that sometimes, whether it's the Bible, whether it's the early Christian writings or whatever, they're not really seeking truth. God gives them over to their lack of desire of truth and stuff. He gives them over to the kingdom of darkness. And so they'll come away with conclusions that they'll try and use some of these writings to actually, as a servant of Satan, to actually dispel, or blaspheme or undermine the character of them or whatever. And most of these people, I can't say all of them, most of these people are probably very sincere in their own right, just like the heretics that the early Christians talk about. Probably a lot of them very sincere, but because their lack of being willing to accept what the New Testament says, and the radical call to abandon this life in order to get the next one that Jesus clearly taught, they don't see the truth. And so I should probably bring this to a close here soon. So First Clement to the Corinthians, Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, I didn't mention that. Ignatius's, 7 or 8 letters, I think it's 7 letters. One of them was to Polycarp, great writings. Second Clement, this early sermon that we have, early 2nd century or late 1st century. The Epistle of Barnabas. Now this is a writing I'm convinced, is the Barnabas. And I'll tell you why in a second. Is the Barnabas that traveled with the Apostle Paul. The writing is amazing. It was well respected by these men that I've come to really know that these guys are going to be exalted by Christ. I mean, their lives are amazing. And so some of these guys, I'll just mention one guy, Clement of Alexandria. So this is a guy that we have some of his writings dated somewhere around, experts are saying somewhere around 190, maybe 200, somewhere around that, maybe even a little bit earlier than that, maybe 185 or something. So his writings that we have, he mentions multiple times that this Barnabas was the Barnabas that traveled with Paul. Now, as you get into the early Christian writings, if you haven't already, you'll start to see these guys a lot of times will talk about what they know. They'll be very clear about the things that they're speculating about, the things that were handed down from the apostles. I'm distinguishing between all these categories. The things that are from Scripture, they'll quote in Scripture all the time, as opposed to many theologians today who just lump it all together. They'll have the things that they know are based on evidence. They'll put their speculations and their conjectures together, and they'll lump it all together and present it as if it's fact. And because they have a THD behind their name or whatever, people swallow it hook, line, and sinker without a distinction between what is speculation based on their own opinions and what parts are actually based on the historic record of what early Christians said or whatever the case may be. But these early church writers weren't like that at all. So I'm convinced, yeah. I mean, I think there's other writers that mention the Epistle of Barnabas, and it's just an amazing, read. I encourage you to check that out. Apocryphally 1970 also has narrated that one a couple of times. There's a couple little nuances of some of the writing. I don't know why he kind of changed it, kind of watered it down a little bit, but like 1 or 2 that I noticed. But it's worth your time to check it out. You'll get a lot of insight of the New Testament unfolding of the meanings of some of the works of the law that Paul talks about. That so many people misunderstand what that means. Works of the law are things like clean, unclean foods. These things that are in the law, there's aspects that have everything to do with loving your neighbor as yourself, right? Like not coveting someone's goods, or not sleeping with their wife, or not lying, not killing, not stealing. All those sorts of things have to do with respect and love and, treating people as you'd want to be treated, which is loving your neighbor as yourself, right? Empathy sort of thing. That's righteousness, right? Other aspect is loving God with everything you got, everything you gave Him. And as Jesus said, that's the fulfillment of the law. Well, after the Israelites, as some of the early Christians helped me to understand, like Irenaeus, I'll explain who he is in a second. But as the Israelites came out of Egypt, and they were given the Decalogue, they were given the 10 Commandments, and they went back to their idolatry and making a golden calf and all these sort of things, and Moses broke the 10 Commandments. that later on God enjoined on them a heavier yoke, which was like 600 and some commandments and stuff. And that's what the book of Deuteronomy, which means second law, nomos in Greek, New Testament Greek means law, and deuteros I think is the word, if I remember that right. Duo definitely means two, but that's basically second, so second law. So this is this heavy yoke that God enjoined on them. So in that, because of their sins, as the early Christians, Epistle of Barnabas says this, Irenaeus says this, because of their sins, God enjoined on them not only the loving your neighbor as yourself and loving God with everything you got aspects, which is righteousness, but also enjoining on them things for their sins. And these are called works of the law. Circumcision of the flesh, which was instituted by Abraham, is also a work of righteousness. And it's mentioned in so many of Paul's letters. And I encourage you to go back every time you see those words used, works of works of the law. Works of the law. I hope I'm saying that right. Distinguished from works of righteousness. Works of righteousness does have everything to do with salvation. We'll talk about that, and we'll see it right in the New Testament versus works of the law. They don't save. They were a foreshadowing of things that have a spiritual meaning in Christ. And the Epistle of Barnabas and Irenaeus' letters or his writings, explain a lot about this. And so the law of sin and death is the Mosaic law that, as Paul says, he emphasizes. I'm not saying the law is bad. The law is good, and he goes on, but he says, but he explains how it shines the light on our sin in our lives. Because once the commandment comes and we break it, Romans chapter 7, Paul says, I died, right? So, when the commandment comes, in our life, we get old enough to where we be able to understand it, our conscience kicks in, whereas when we're an infant, that's not the case. And so when we break the commandment, just as Adam and Eve did, we die. And so now the law of sin and death has government over our lives, and we need a Savior, right? So that's a whole other thing. But we'll talk about that at some other time more. But so these writings of the apostles, of the early Christians, as I had mentioned, Clement of Alexandria, 190, he talks about Epistle of Barnabas as being the writing from the Barnabas that traveled with Paul. So I've mentioned, the writings of Ignatius, First Clement to the Corinthians, Second Clement, an early sermon, Epistle of Barnabas, Polycarp's letter to the Philippians. I encourage you to read these. First and Second Apology of Justin Martyr is probably chronologically, as we're moving outwards, somewhere around 140, 150, maybe something like that, are those writings. And then the Dialogue with Trypho the Jew by Justin Martyr is an amazing writing if you want to understand the Old Testament and see foreshadowings of Christ and the footprints of Christ and the evidence of Christ in the Old Testament all over the place. I encourage you, jump into Dialogue with Trypho the Jew. You're going to get a little bit with Barnabas. He's going to explain a lot of stuff from the law and seeing a lot of things. But Dialogue with Trypho the Jew, if you want to see messianic prophecies, foreshadowings of Christ, that is the writing. That is amazing. Another writing a little bit later, Irenaeus, who was a disciple of Polycarp. I had mentioned Polycarp, that letter to the Philippians. Well, Polycarp was a student of the Apostle John. So the Apostle John died around 100. Polycarp died as a martyr around 156, 157. And so he was with the church, helping, I'm sure there were other leaders that we just don't have record of that were disciples of the apostles, just like Clement was. He's mentioned in the New Testament. Another writing, I haven't mentioned this one, The Shepherd of Hermas is an amazing writing. Irenaeus mentions that and actually calls it scripture. And so these are writings that were with the church, edifying the church. There was no New Testament canon. That came later. The first release of the hey, let's pick out and try and figure out using men's wisdom of what books are actually canonized and which ones aren't, which ones are actually come from God and inspired by the Holy Spirit and which one hasn't. That happened in the 4th century, which is the 300s. So 390 was the first release of that. So up until that time, that was the period of Constantine in the 300s. So up until that time, the churches were all independent, even though from a fraternal point of view, they were all helping one another, which is what we see in the New Testament. Paul is encouraging that, the early, Peter, James, all these writings encouraging that, Hebrews. John, he says in 1 John, he's like, if you don't do that, how can you say the love of God is not in you? Or say that the love of God is in you? And so, so they were independent in the sense that every local bishop, or episcopon is the Greek word, overseer, the one that's kind of put in charge. And then the elders, who are the mature Christians that have, been through the New Testament teaching and have become to a point of produce, godly fruit, as the kind of the job descriptions that we see in Paul's letters, like 1 Timothy and Titus, kind of gives these descriptions of these godly maturity of fruit of people that are chosen as elders. And the word in presbyteros in Greek actually means like somebody that's older, an elder, as we would think of it. Like we would see somebody that's older, that's elderly, maybe in a nursing home or something. And so that's basically what that word means, because it's used in context in the New Testament where it actually is distinguishing between a younger person and an older person that's using that word. And so, so I can say that with full confidence. So somebody that's mature, so those are the people that are put in charge. And then, of course, there were deacons, who the word actually means like a servant. And so this was kind of the hierarchy of the church, as we see in the New Testament and stuff. And so, so going back to what we were talking about with these early Christian writings, so Irenaeus, we got his writings. So Irenaeus was under the tutelage of Polycarp. Polycarp, like I said, was under the tutelage of John the Apostle. And so Irenaeus, having learned from Polycarp, we got 2 writings from him. Like I said, it's dated around 180. And these are amazing writings. I really encourage you to check these out. In His Word is the YouTube channel that this woman, God bless her, that she narrated, this writing from Irenaeus called Demonstration of the Apostolic Preaching. If you want to get a hard copy of it, you can find it on Amazon. An alternative name, AKA, is On the Apostolic Preaching. You'll find that on Amazon. I've got a couple copies of that. So that's amazing writing. It's really very brief in comparison to the other writing that we have of his, which is very thick writing, and it's broken up into 5 books, and it's called Against Heresies, or Against All Heresies. And so that's amazing. There's LibriVox recordings of that. I think it's Plus Media is the name of the YouTube channel. And so we got those narrated. And so you can find those. I just stumbled on those recently. But those are amazing. The first 2 books especially, he explains all these different Gnostic, denominations or sects, S-E-C-T-S, sectors, I guess you could say that, sects of Gnosticism, where there's different variations and stuff. There's some common ground that they believed among them, but others some differences and stuff. So he explains all these different, heretical teachings and groups and stuff. Book 3 is kind of a little bit of that. He's starting to bridge over and starting to get into talking more about what Christianity, true Christianity, is like. And some good stuff in there. But Book 4 and Book 5 is just rich with, just full of understanding what the apostles really taught, and understanding and seeing Christ in the Old Testament, just like Dialogue with Trifle the Jew, but really just putting it together with the teaching of the gospel in the New Testament. It's amazing. It's amazing. So I'm continuing to go through those. And so let's see if I've missed any. Up to this point, 180-ish time frame. Like I said, after that is Clement of Alexandria. I've kind of gotten into some of his writings, a reasonable amount. But that's pretty much as far as I've gone. Other than that, I've been exposed to some things from Tertullian here and there, and Cyprian, and some things in the 3rd century, which is the 200s. Just, whether it's this amazing work that David Berceau did, the Dictionary on the Early Christian Beliefs, just seeing some things. He's got topically divided where you can see, if you want to look up baptism, you'll see, hey, look at different quotes that the early Christians said about baptism, or judgment, or fear of God, or, all these different sorts of things that you could think of. Look it up in there and see what he says about it, maybe even original sin, or Adam's, or something, in that regard. But yeah, so exposed in that way. Even some of the material, like I said, probably 20-some CDs 5 years ago when I first started out looking at David Berceau's material. Listened to his topical CDs, kind of like what I'm going to try and do on YouTube here on some things. Just getting exposed to 3rd century in that regard. Also, even in some regards, often the times of Constantine and stuff, got some stuff from him. Another guy I've learned a lot from, Paul Pavao. He's got some good stuff. He's a kind of a guy that he'll say, hey, he's more of a second century guy, but he wrote a book on Council of Nicaea, which is around 325-ish. So he's got a lot of stuff in there in that regard. Yeah, just bits and pieces here and there. The whole thing when the Apostolic Constitutions was released, and around 390 with the first release of the first cut of the Universal New Testament, the New Testament that we have now, and the first cut actually had 28 books. So First Clement to the Corinthians was in the first cut, but it eventually got pushed out, and now we have only 27 books. They had, I mean, they did it kind of a democratic process, which I think Satan used that, so that some of the that there was wheat and tares amongst them at that period of time, and so some of the ones that disparaged, the Epistle of Barnabas or Shepherd of Hermas or some of these early writings, that the really super righteous second century Christian writers, their amazing lives, that they all embraced, they kind of got pushed out, and so otherwise our New Testament would have the Epistle of Barnabas, they would have the Shepherd of Hermas, they would have, I would think Second Clement, First Clement to the Corinthians, they would have Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, because if you think about it, just intuitively, it's like, okay, if we only had the writings in the New Testament that were the apostles, we would have a lot fewer writings. But we have the Gospel of Luke, who traveled with Apostle Paul. Well, we got Ignatius, we got Clement, we got Polycarp. These guys, similar, likewise, knowing one or more of the apostles. Ignatius was put in place as the episcopon, or as the overseer, the bishop, what are you going to call him, in the church in Antioch, following Peter, put there by Peter, and so these guys, they knew John, they knew Peter, they knew maybe even possibly other apostles and stuff. So the Gospel of Mark, John Mark traveled with, he was the I think the cousin, but he was or the nephew, but he was the relative of Barnabas. And so, he gave an account of what he got from the Apostle Peter, according to early Christian writings, very early, that, he followed Peter around, and Peter even mentions him in his letters, and that he wrote down what Peter said, and then we have the Gospel according to Mark, and it was basically the Gospel according to Peter that was kind of a secretary with Mark taking it down and stuff. So if you look at that, these guys weren't even apostles, right? Mark and Luke, and in the sense of what we would understand the apostles, the 12 apostles, Matthias, in Acts chapter 1, they cast lots, and he was to replace Judas. And then the one that Paul said was abnormally born, he came later, so we got the 13 apostles. So outside of those guys, we got some of these other guys, James writing the book that we have, the Epistle of that, which is amazing writing. We have the book of Hebrews, that, we got some early writings kind of talking about who that was, but people have disagreements of who that was, whether it was Barnabas that wrote it, or whether it was the Apostle Paul that wrote it. But I mean, some of these writings that we have, we may not even have because of the controversy and stuff or whatever, if we only say, well, it's definitely got to be the apostles only. So these writings were very, very well embraced by the church in the second century, and I hope you check them out. So I'm going to have a lot of topical things on this channel. This is a very long introduction. I hope I didn't put you to sleep, but hopefully I can help you. That's how I live my life. I mean, that's what my life is all about, trying to help people know God. When I'm constantly going out, whether I'm passing out little thought-provoking tracts or talking to people, trying to help people as an engineer to understand a lot of the claims that are in the textbooks and stuff, or embellishments and over-exaggerations about the evidence for evolution, and forsaking to actually give the evidence that shows counter to evolution and stuff. And it's when I'm talking to a lot of these people, I'm trying to help them to see, look, I'm just trying to help people, and that's pretty much what I try and do with most of the things I do in my life. So I've been spending about a year and a half studying early New Testament Greek, Koine Greek, and I'm about ready to take a course at Polis Institute. I'm very excited about. It starts May 16th at Ave Maria University down in Southwest Florida and stuff. So that's going to be really good. For over 2 years now, I've been doing open air preaching, going out on the streets and preaching, and helping people to try and understand the truth and stuff. There's so much mixture of truth and error out there. It's all over the place. I mean, I know Protestants are so confident, even though there's tens of thousands of, I've heard over 20,000 denominations and stuff. The Catholic Church, boasts the fact that they've been maintained all the way from the beginning. But the Protestants don't seem to have a problem with the fact that they keep splintering, and it's very sad and stuff. But it's a mixture of truth and error all over the place. And I use the standard of primarily the scriptures, but the early Christians have helped me to see clearly I can just take literally what the New Testament says. Especially as I've been studying Greek, I've seen certain words that, is, kind of the way it's presented in English and stuff, could have done a better job. And so that's a whole nother YouTube. I'll talk about that. It can make us very uncomfortable, so I got to be real careful with that, because the scriptures are totally trustworthy. I really encourage people to get into the early Christians, and it'll help you to understand the role of the Old Testament in the New Testament, and in this new covenant that we have through Christ. And that's what I mean by that. But also, understanding rightly the New Testament, because as Peter explains in 2 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 15 through 17, that even back then, people were misunderstanding Paul's writings and just twisting them, and the Gnostics were using them. A guy, early 2nd century, Marcion, when he first came into the real Orthodox Church, the real church, Orthodox meaning like the, the teaching as it was handed down and stuff, without, deviation and stuff. But as he came into the church, I mean, he gave, just like Jesus said, he gave up his wealth and gave it to the poor. And so he got a lot of respect for that. So when he started kind of being influenced by demons and starting to come up with heretical teachings and stuff and things that diverged and actually blasphemed, the God of the Old Testament as being different from the God of the New Testament, which is a fundamental Gnostic teaching and stuff, that even some of the belief systems of Christianity today can cause people to start to think that and stuff, but even though they won't really want to admit it. But anyway, so that fundamental sort of thing, so that Marcion started kind of coming up with his own little idea of what a New Testament was, and he took it exclusively from Paul's writings, and he picked and chose. He excluded 1st and 2nd Timothy, because there are some pretty hard-hitting passages or things that Paul talks about in there that really, the Gnostic doctrines couldn't stand up against and stuff. So it kind of picked and chose, and it was kind of a buffet-style sort of thing that he did, and then he included certain parts of the Gospel of Luke and stuff. And so that was the sort of thing that was happening. That wasn't the only case, but that was one example that's well documented with early Christian writings and stuff. What Peter's talking about, and he says in there that many people were taking Paul's writings. He said, our dear brother Paul, that writes the same way in all his writings, that many people, distort his teachings and his writings, because he writes the same way in all his writings. This is what Peter says. And they distort what he says to their own destruction and to the destruction of their followers as well and stuff. And then he goes on in that letter in his closing remarks in 2 Peter. Again, this is chapter 3, 15 through 17. And so he's heading towards the closing there, and he says, you've been warned, And so many of the heretical doctrines today are largely based on Paul's writings. And many people they're not even apologetic to say, I follow Paul. Even though 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul disparages that. He says, some say I follow Paul, I follow Apollos, and some say I follow Cephas. And he says, did Paul die for you? Was he on the cross and all this sort of thing? Apollos or whatever, were you baptized in the name of Paul? So he basically saying, no, it's about Christ. It's not about us, So many people are like, I've met when I'm out evangelizing, I'm talking to people, will be like, oh, I go with Paul's writings. But really, it's their understanding of what Paul says. Because if you understand rightly what Paul says, you won't dismiss the things that Jesus says, because Jesus' teachings so much emphasize what you do. That's why people they shipwreck what Paul's saying, and they therefore have to dismiss what Jesus says, and yet they call themselves followers of Jesus. And so that's a whole other talk. But in closing, yeah, so in this YouTube channel, my plan is to go through a lot of different topical things, and I hope that I can help in some way, just share some things both in the scriptures and early Christians say, and then help all the puzzle pieces start to come together so people can start to see what the New Testament really teaches and stuff. And so I just pray that the Lord helps me with that and stuff. So, but God bless you, and I hope that you're edified and blessed by the things I share on this channel. All right, God bless.